Welcome back to the Owl Talk podcast. I'm your host, Drew Carpenter. We'll continue our discussion into the history of Sigma Pi, specifically what was lost throughout the years. Grand Second Counselor Christian Miele is here with me to recover the past of our fraternity. Christian, welcome to the podcast. In today's Sigma Pi, we use a flag that has the radiant triangle in the top left corner. However, that differs from what the official flag is. How do these two contrast?
So this is an interesting one, and one that I looked up a number of years ago in the Constitution, because I noticed that what's stated in the Constitution isn't exactly what you always see more often than not. So I think most of us, when we think about the Sigma Pi flag, we think about, the purple flag with the white Greek letters, Sigma and Pi, in the middle of the flag, and then the 10, gold stars, the, radiant triangle, without the border, of course, in the upper left-hand corner of that V-notched flag. But in our Constitution, actually, it states that, really we've got the coat of arms, the white coat of arms, emblazoned on the top left corner of our flag. And so, it turns out, first of all, that our flag was actually created by Lewis L. Moore, who was the fraternity's fifth Grand Sage, and he produced the first flag of the official design, and he displayed it at the fourth biennial convocation, which would have been held in 1914, and then which was, by the way, in Champaign, Illinois. And he then, I guess, displayed it again at the fifth convocation at Ada, Ohio, in 1916. And that first original flag was what was referred to as a splendid piece of handiwork in silk, with the proper colors laid on with oil paints and gold. And Brother Moore had bestowed this flag on Delta chapter from University of Pennsylvania. And then it was preserved in the custody of the Grand Herald, and I guess it eventually made its way to the national headquarters. But in fact, the following, I'll just read the original constitutional requirements for the Sigma Pi flag. It said that the flag of Sigma Pi shall be a lavender field with the Greek letters Sigma and Pi, and the coat of arms of the fraternity emblazoned in white thereon. The letter shall occupy the center of the field, and the coat of arms shall be placed in the upper corner nearest the staff. The cross in the center of the coat of arms shall be of gold. The width of the flag shall be 5 feet. The length along the upper and lower edges shall be 7 feet. And the length along the line equidistant from the upper and lower edges shall be 6 feet. The total height of the coat of arms shall be 18 inches and the total width 15 inches. So it was very specific in terms of the dimensions. And even now, when I was an undergraduate, I purchased the full 5x7 flag, which is the official size. They also sell the flag these days in a 3x5 size. But when I got the 5x7 when I was an undergrad, and it had the coat of arms on it, because I guess I was a nerd and I wanted the official flag. But however, at some point, I guess they started making the coat of arms in all white, whereas this original description actually said that the in the center of the coat of arms, the cross should be gold, which we no longer do. So it's sort of an interesting history behind the flag. But again, I think both are still available for purchase if you need one for your chapter house or just for your dorm room or something like that. But it's all credit to past Grand Sage Lewis L. Moore of Kappa chapter for the original design.
Well, and to your point, Christian, I've seen plenty of the unofficial flags hanging up at fraternity houses, like you mentioned, dorm rooms, or just across our campus, or across our campuses rather. So it's interesting to hear that that's not the official flag of Sigma Pi. It's still welcomed and still widely used, but there's another flag out there that our brothers could be looking into. So
absolutely. And I will say that the flag, the more commonly seen flag, which is the one with the 10 gold stars and the equilateral triangle, that is still quote unquote somewhat official, because it's officially our alternate flag. So it is still provided for in our governing documents as the alternate flag. Much the same way with our flower, that the lilac and white roses, with the goldenrod as an auxiliary, is sort of the alternate flower. Same thing applies to our flag.
Very nice. Good to know. Our next question today, I'd love for somebody to walk us through how the original version of the National Executive Office differs from what we know today as the Grand Council.
It's a bit convoluted, and so I will do my best to sort of trudge through it and give our brothers an easy to understand a historical, understanding of how the terminology of our grand officers has changed and sort of evolved over the years, and it's really a rich sort of walk through our history, because as we know, when our fraternity first became a quote unquote national fraternity, it was done through the machinations of Robert George Patterson, who, of course, foisted upon an unsuspecting Tau Phi Delta group. He originally reached out to them in December of 1906. By February 11th, 1907, Tau Phi Delta had disbanded as such and had taken on the name Alpha Chapter of Sigma Pi. And so because they had, quote unquote, joined a national fraternity, even though it was, one with an apocryphal history that was completely fabricated by Patterson himself, not to be confused, by the way, with founder George Martin Patterson. There was no relation between the two Pattersons, of course. But Robert George Patterson had not only invented, this fake history for his Sigma Pi fraternity that he then, duped a number of men into joining, but he also, of course, created a ritual for this fabricated fraternity, as well as a constitution and a full government, really, for how this Sigma Pi fraternity would be governed at the time. And so you have to first understand that things were a lot different back then. There was no executive office. There was no central office or headquarters. And so in the early days of our fraternity, like most fraternities, the day-to-day administrative and executive functions were actually carried out by the national officers, or as we know them today, are the grand officers. When the executive office was established in Sigma Pi's case in the mid-1920s, the executive secretary, the first of whom was Harold Jacobson, of course, one of our honorary grand sages and just a lion in sort of our history. The executive office assumed a lot of those day-to-day administrative responsibilities. And so it's important to sort of understand that so you can understand the evolution of the titles and the terminology and nomenclature. So under Patterson's constitution, so we're talking, from 1907 until 1910, when Patterson's expulsion was ultimately ratified at the Second Biennial Convocation in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, there were, national officers. You had your national president. And this, by the way, is before we had the titles Grand Sage, Grand Second Counselor, Grand Herald, etc., which those titles came into being when we adopted the Golden Quest because they have a ritualistic significance for Sigma Pi, of course. So initially, before there was a Golden Quest, when Patterson had his constitution and his ritual, the titles of the grand officers, which were then known as national officers, were national president, national vice president at large, and that sort of stems back to this idea of province archons, which we talked about in our previously in our previous episode, that back then they had a vice president for every state who was to be known as a regent, which ultimately became sort of your province archon system. So you had this national vice president at large, and then you had a master of the exchequer, which was our treasurer at the time, national treasurer. Then they had a national secretary. They had provisions for an assistant secretary. Then they had a secretary of this thing called the Board of Inquiry, which handled petitions and expansion, petitions to charter and expansion and the like. And so that's the way we operated, where you had, just national officers. They weren't really collectively known as anything but national officers. But Patterson also had a something known as an executive committee that sort of was an overarching body of quote unquote fraternity elders, which focused also some of its energy on being a court of appeals for judicial issues and disciplinary issues and matters. And so, the grand officers, national president and the national secretary obviously had a lot of that day-to-day administrative function under their purview. But this executive committee, as it was called then, was these fraternity elders who sort of had a lot of autonomy to make policy without necessarily any approval of the national conventions when they were assembled or these national officers. And so you then fast forward to 1910, after the Patterson episode gets exposed and the fraternity is sufficiently humiliated by that, and it's starting to sort of reconstruct and repair its reputation both internally among its chapters and externally in the larger interfraternity world or Greek world, we really had to, change and cast off some of those Patterson, inventions and kind of create our own path. And so, obviously, in 1910, we adopt the Golden Quest, which was the work of M. Atlee Ermold and Byron R. Lewis. That was sort of, it had its derivation in the original Sigma Delta ritual. Sigma Delta, of course, being the local fraternity that eventually became our fourth chapter or Kappa chapter at Temple University. And so at that point, we then adopted the titles that we use today for our grand officers, grand sage, etc. But we also still had this executive committee, which was a vestige of Patterson. I mean, they didn't get rid of all the Patterson inventions right away, and many of them exist to this day. For example, the emerald, that was a Patterson invention. Our very name was a Patterson invention. The colors of the fraternity was a Patterson invention. So a lot of that stuff today is still very much it had the Patterson touch. But the executive committee eventually gave way, and its name was changed to executive council, but it was still this body of elders. And then that started to slowly change as we marched toward this executive office in the mid-1920s. At that point, the individual grand officers did less and less of the day-to-day function of actually running the operations of the fraternity, and they became more of the board of directors that we have today, where they were volunteers and they weren't paid, unlike the executive office staff, the executive secretary, and then ultimately his team, as he later, had a traveling secretary that worked underneath him. And we eventually expanded that, and expanded that further as we have today, a much larger and more robust staff. The grand officers eventually assumed the executive council as a name referring to the entire board of directors. And in the 1960s, I think it was either 62 or 64, that body became known as the Grand Council, which we have today. And then our chapter officers collectively became known as an executive council. And so you can see how the names and the terminology have changed quite a bit over the years. It does get a little confusing as you move from the Patterson era to 1912 and beyond, where we really started to see much of what we see today come into being. But now today, we again have our grand officers with the current titles, but again we're functioning more as a nonprofit or corporate board of directors, and we still have those administrative functions even in 2023 that are handled by our executive office and our staff. So hopefully that answers your question. It's a bit of a deep dive, and happy to talk to any of our brothers offline about it if they want some source material, kind of showing the evolution of our titles and our history with regard to our national officers in the executive office. But there it is. That's part of our lost history.
Joe knows this about me, Christian, but I'm a huge history buff. So being able to hear how our fraternity has developed over 126 years, it's super interesting for me. And I know that many of our listeners are enjoying this, like you said, deep dive into the fraternity's history and what has been lost to time. So super interesting, and I appreciate you sharing.
Absolutely. I'll just add one more thing. I mean, I forgot to mention that, eventually that group of elders was sort of subsumed and became sort of synonymous with the executive council, which eventually became the Grand Council. So there stopped being this, super legislative body and super judicial body, which was that group of elders. And when the executive office came into being, then we basically just had two bodies. You had your grand officers and then your executive office. There was no longer this additional group sort of overseeing the national officers, if that makes sense. I just wanted to kind of clarify that.
My last question for the day. What can you tell us about the history around the fraternity's official flower?
Well, according to the 1923 Sigma Pi book, which was sort of the fraternity's first attempt at laying out our history in a printed form, other than what had appeared in the several issues of the Emerald. And I'll preface that by saying that the Sigma Pi book, its authors Louis L. Moore, Curtis G. Shake, and Byron R. Lewis didn't consider it an exhaustive history or complete history. They had always hoped that future generations would put out a more comprehensive and full history of the fraternity, which is something that we are actively working on today. But when we're talking about the flower, we have to recognize that, before there was Sigma Pi, there was, of course, Tau Phi Delta. And, I actually scoured all of the Tau Phi Delta minutes that we have in our archives. I also looked at the original Tau Phi Delta Constitution that we have, the oldest of which is from the 1899 reorganization of Tau Phi Delta. And I couldn't find anything about the flower. However, in this 1923 Sigma Pi book, it actually says that Tau Phi Delta's flower was the red clover. Now, I don't know if that was unofficial because it wasn't in any of the governing documents or their constitution or bylaws at the time, but it was said, and so we have to assume that that is the case, that the red clover was the fraternity's official flower, even though it wasn't ever the flower of Sigma Pi since we've been known as such. But if the fraternity doesn't, in fact, date back to 1897, the days of Tau Phi Delta, then the red clover would be our first flower. And it remained so, I guess, until, Tau Phi Delta became the alpha chapter of Robert George Patterson's apocryphal Sigma Pi fraternity, which, again, as we talked about earlier, had a completely fabricated history, a fabricated constitution, and a fabricated ritual when you think about it. And the first mention of the flower, though, is, as we know today, is in Patterson's fabricated constitution circa 1907, which states that, and I'll quote, it says, quote, "The flowers of the Sigma Pi fraternity are the lilac and white rose," end quote. However, in a letter to Byron R. Lewis dated April 2nd, 1908, Patterson himself writes that, quote, "The flowers are either the lavender orchid or the white rose and lilac," end quote. So after Patterson's expulsion from the fraternity in 1910, Byron R. Lewis and Lewis L. Moore were tapped to basically draft a new constitution, which we now know as the Lewis-Moore Constitution, circa 1912. And in that 1912 Constitution, Article 10, Section 3, provides that, quote, "The flower of Sigma Pi is the lavender orchid, but owing to the rarity of this flower, the lilac and white rose may be used together with the goldenrod in the fall." And so really from that point forward, it was really solidified that, the lavender orchid was the flower. And then the lilac and white rose, could be used together with the goldenrod in the fall as some sort of, alternate flower. Now, some other terminology, for example, in our Constitution, it may say, for example, may be used as an auxiliary. That language would later be adopted in connection with this alternate flower. And at some point, that seasonal usage provision, about using the goldenrod in the fall, that was also later dropped. But today, interestingly, and we're still doing some research around this, today the Constitution of Sigma Pi reads that, quote, "The flower of the fraternity shall be the orchid, with the lilac and white rose together as an alternate. The goldenrod may be used as an auxiliary." And so what immediately jumped out to me when I was reading, sort of the current iteration of our Constitution is that the word lavender no longer officially appears in our Constitution. It was omitted at least a decade ago. We're trying to pinpoint when exactly, although I think it was probably a bit even further back than that. But its omission, I think, was possibly either a typographical error as they were, transcribing, one constitution to the next, as they update it every biennium after the convocation, rather. But it's also entirely possible that the change was made because brothers may have had a difficult time finding lavender-colored orchids, and so maybe it was their brilliant idea at some later point to just say, well, let's just call it the orchid, get rid of the word lavender or the color lavender, and it'll make it easier for brothers to procure this. I think that's less likely the case. I think, again, because if you look at the I Believe manual, the Sigma Pi manual, and ask Chris Carter who works on that, it still has lavender orchid in there. And so I think probably it was some sort of mistake. And as Joe talked about in an earlier episode, when we were talking about potentially going from province to region in terms of our province archons becoming regional advisors, which is, nomenclature better understood, I think, by most lay people. I think when most people think about our colors and our flower, they absolutely have, lavender in there before orchid. And so after all, lavender is one of the fraternity's official colors. So I would argue that it would probably make sense to have lavender added as a prefix to orchid, in some later, constitutional amendment, just to make sure that it's back in there. But again, hopefully before the next convocation, we'll pinpoint exactly when the change was made. And, as we always talk about, we've got this great wealth of knowledge in the digital Emerald Archive online on sigmapi.org. So maybe you undergraduate brothers out there can help past Grand Sage Palazzolo and I, as we work on the National History book, actually determine if there was some, good reason to make the change, or if it was just some sort of scrivener's or typographical error where they forgot to, include the word lavender before orchid. But in short, or I should say, in long story short or short story long, that is the history and the evolution of the Sigma Pi flower. Very interesting indeed, and something that we're quite proud of.
Thank you, Christian, for providing some great insight on these unique moments in our fraternity's history. For everyone listening, hit the subscribe and please leave a rating and review on your favorite podcast platform. And as always, I believe.